Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys. I want to try something a little different tonight, something that I don't normally do. And that is get into some sort of inside baseball politics or Catholic stuff, I guess you could say, within certain elements of the Catholic online community and some of the struggles that I believe Catholics face in America at this point in history, especially as the culture continues to deteriorate. The political system has become, well, from my perspective at least, abjectly corrupt. And the response and how to deal with an ever devolving civilization at this point in history, especially as nefarious forces and alternative ideologies that are inherently anti-Christian and anti-Catholic rise to the forefront of society, and how Catholics should respond to such times. And it's very difficult because even within the realm of Catholicism, everybody has a little bit of different point of view because Catholicism is inherently a global view in terms of how the church has this grand universal outlook about religion, life, and politics. It's never been tied to a single culture or nation throughout history. It has obviously a centralized belief in its theology, but how it governs in terms of politics, culture, society, and economics, the church has always had a broad scope of, how should I say this, tolerance in those terms and how it deals with every culture. It's why Catholicism, unlike like something like Protestantism or other religions, has always fit well pretty much globally into different parts of the world, as it allows for the indigenous culture to flourish while infusing the faith within those cultures, right? It's like if you go to Asia and you see things like, Catholic churches over there, you look at their style, their molds, and things of that nature, and you'll see something that looks like a Shinto temple, but only it'll be full of like Catholic saints and the Catholic altars. You have the Catholic sacrifice there, things of that nature. Sacrifice in terms of the Mass, obviously, and how Catholicism has given room for cultures to individually shine and stand out on their own, while also inherently being Catholic without contradicting the faith and the doctrine and the practice of the church itself. And it's fascinating, right? Because even in America, when you look back at the early times of the founding and really all throughout the 1800s, the way Catholicism molded um, with the Irish and the Germans early on, and the differences between the Irish and the German immigrants, um, the Germans being very ethnocentric and creating parishes that were ethnocentric, where they kept to themselves and they created German parishes, while the Irish, who had a greater common cause with the I guess the Anglo population, because they had a common enemy historically with the British Empire. They also spoke the same language or similar language in English, were more nationalists, of course. They didn't believe in sort of ethnocentric parishes. And so here you had a split between even sort of Catholics early on in America, between those that were kind of just like, okay, we speak our language, we have our own community, leave us alone. And while the Irish were pushing a grander idea of Catholicism, saying, wait a minute, no. We got to intermix and make sort of Catholicism and this grander idea of America work together. And you saw some differences there, obviously. And then, of course, here come the Italians in the biggest wave of all as far as European immigration. And here come, again, the Italians with their statues. And the Irish become very uncomfortable as they believe that the Italians and the Sicilians are worshiping their statues, right? Because Sicilians were probably, or Southern Italians we're probably the least educated of all. And as I said before, when you have a population that has been run through revolutionary periods and world wars and great illiteracy, there's a less focus, for example, on the intellectual side of the faith, and a bigger focus on the faith where the senses are used, right? Where we feel, touch, smell, sound, things of that nature, people that focus on the aspect of the faith that they can partake in. And that's the beauty about Catholicism, is that it can be um, partaken in various different forms. And so when there's a great focus on the exterior of the faith, right? The sort of the practical um, elements of the faith, where people are more uh, outwardly expressive. Those Catholics get accused by other Catholics of being idolatry worshipers in some respect, which of course is absolutely silly considering where they came from, and if you understand their struggle and their plight and how they take on their faith. You can't focus on an intellectual Catholicism when you can't read, right? Right. But our Lord doesn't limit us to the ability just to be centered around a gospel on the written word or an intellectual word alone. This is the arrogance of Protestantism, right? That simply believes it can infuse its own sola scriptura mantra on anybody that they want. That's why sola scriptura was always an ideology, a heretical ideology that was primarily founded in areas where there was greater literacy, right? Where in parts of the world where you had greater illiteracy because of fundamental breakdowns of institutions and lack of developments in those societies, they focus more on the external elements of the faith. Not that you didn't have people reading Bibles, for example, in those regions, but you may have had in institutions, the priests read the Bible to you, right? You went to mass. That's where the Bible was presented to you, or at least the gospels were presented to you. And so these are the challenges that Catholics have always faced. In America, I'm giving you, in a nutshell, a short example of how Catholics have dealt with politics, culture, history, tradition, things of that nature, when they especially come together from all parts of the world, from different cultures and customs, and you put Catholics together in America, in this melting pot, and how we all interact with one another. And you see this online in many ways, right? As you see this great divide between Catholics in the political world, and how Catholics are dealing with a political system now that has Catholics really at each other's throats. We've seen that Candace Owens recently have a conversion to Catholic faith, and she's questioning a lot of the elements of American politics and culture and things of that nature. Another name that's out there that's making news right now is Nick Fuentes. He's another guy that's he's been controversial in a lot of different ways, cast off of certain platforms. He's over, I believe, on Rumble now over there, and he's been associated with what the liberal society calls extreme groups, right? Like white nationalism, and even being accused of Nazism, things of that nature. I don't know. I don't follow Mr. Fuentes all that closely. I've seen a few of his podcasts. Um, I find him very interesting, but again, I don't subscribe to a lot of the racial elements that at times he has subscribed to. That's just not my cup of tea. I wasn't raised sort of with those ideas. Now, I am a big believer in cultural hegemony, without a doubt. But at the same time, I also realize that in America, which is now, a society mixed in every kind of way, that racial fluidity is just a reality of life, and I don't know how we get around that. And see, that's the interesting thing about it, is that when you look at Catholicism and you look at the different branches and how Catholics don't conform, right, to liberal society, because Catholics, we believe we have an essential eternal truth that has been handed down now for 2,000 and 5,000 years, right? Going all the way back to Jesus Christ at the very least. Where Protestant culture is one that's a conformist society where they have to kind of have a theology based upon subjective truth, so they always don't go to war against one another, right? This is the grand divide of the Protestant revolt and what has shaped Western civilization since the 16th century. And so when you have an ideology like Protestantism that's always conforming, you always need a sort of a low common denominator in order for that society to work. And what's that low common denominator? Well, I think many of you in a political terms would probably consider that something like the Republican Party's big tent, right? Where we bring everybody in to sort of try and bring peace, but you kind of water down your values within that tent. Protestantism has done the same thing, right? Because in many ways, Protestantism was the first democratic sort of system created or ideology created where you could pick and choose your subjective truth based upon your subjective point of view because you have a subjective fallen interpretation of the Bible. We Catholics don't have that struggle. We have an eternal truth that's been given to us by the church. The church determines for us, these are the governing body of laws. This is what we follow. And in many ways, this is why Catholic societies and Catholic peoples are a pain in the butt to govern, because you simply can't feed us a bunch of subjective truth and expect us to buy it. This is the eternal truth, right? For example, something like abortion. There's no there is no gray area with abortion. The church says that, and the Bible teaches us, and sacred tradition teaches us, and the fathers of the church teach us, and the doctors of the church teach us that this is an inherent evil. There's no way for us to get around the fact that abortion is a great moral wrong, and therefore you can't get us to buy that notion for those of us that are devout, right? And I guess in that sense, why Catholics led the pro-life movement early on in America in the early 1970s. Evangelicals and Protestants would come on board later on, but primarily at first, the focus of the pro-life movement in America was a Catholic movement. I think one of the other issues I think that gives us, is probably a better example is contraception, right? Protestants tend to explain away contraception through their subjective interpretation of scripture to accommodate the convenience of modern society, while we Catholics continue to say, based on sacred tradition and what the doctrine of the church has said, and what the church has said in general, that it is inherently a fundamental moral evil, right? So in that sense, this is why Catholics are hard to govern, right? Right. And I believe something like contraception, for example, was introduced to the general population to accommodate the liberal political nature of a liberal society, basically to shackle us in a way, to use sexuality and sexual revolution as a way to manipulate and control people, right? This is why we've seen the rise of feminism. This is why we've seen the emasculation of men in our society, purposely done by liberal forces to socially engineer us in a certain direction, right? Right. And so when Catholics don't subscribe to something like the evils of, or should I say, the fundamental, what do you want to call it, nature of contraception and trying to use contraception to manipulate a Catholic society, we become a pain in the butt and we oppose everything based upon the dictates of a faith that goes back for 2,000 years. And that's not the way politics works, especially in liberal societies where we have constant social engineering. We just become a pain in the butt. You can't alter that at the end of the day. And this is the problem that really expands out in the political sense. And you see this really with divisions within the Catholic communities online, right? You look at Protestants today in America, they're pretty much lockstep in line with the American founding, right? God gave us this great republic. He gave us the right to vote. As long as we all go out there and vote and do our due diligence and have some adherence to the faith, God will always protect America. But for the most part, Protestants are, Constitution loving, Constitution thumping Bible Americans. And this great republic of ours with the ability to vote is inherently a Christian nation. At least that's their beliefs. Of course, with us Catholics, again, we don't necessarily buy into a lot of these ideas of the Enlightenment. And democracy for Catholics has always been very difficult because Christianity is not a democratic movement. Christ is a king. God the Father and the Holy Spirit, the Blessed Trinity, they are kings of our lives. They are authoritarian rulers. Granted, they are, good authoritarian rulers. They are noble, benevolent authoritarian rulers, and that's who we follow, regardless. It is not to come down to the will of the people or our individual interpretation of how society should be governed. We follow God, period, the end, through the church that he established upon Peter the Rock. And this is why, for Protestants, any other form of government is very difficult because just as they were able to subjectively choose whatever branch or idea of Protestantism they got to choose, within the realm of the Catholic faith, there is not a choice. You simply follow the faith that has been passed on by our ancestors, right? And so this is the struggle with many Americans that we have. And there's also struggle with many Catholics when the realm of this American liberal Protestant society about governance in and of itself. As many Catholic Americans raised in the liberal society who want to love their nation, want to believe in their nation, partake in their nation from a, from a historical perspective, have embraced liberalism in many ways and believe the system could work, or at least try to believe that the system could work in a way where it falls in line with their Catholic faith and, of course, their American heritage that they were born with in this country, right? And then there's another group of Catholics that are more divided, say, wait, we need to go back to something of the past, right? This is why you have these monarchist movements online, you have fascist movements online, you have integralist movements online, all which vary in degree about governance to a certain degree. But the one thing all these groups continue to point out to the American Catholics is, well, wait a minute, this thing with democracy, liberal republicanism, everything that's been embraced after the Enlightenment is problematic. And this is why society continues to become um, not only devolve, right, but is inherently becoming more and more anti-Christ. Of course, the other side, which embraces sort of democratic liberalism, this Catholic side believes we have to work with the system itself that we have because that's what we inherited. It's what we have. What the other side is preaching is something that would upend the entire system. And so there's this grand debate between these two Catholic camps about governance and culture and how we should kind of move forward. And it's fascinating to watch these debates online. Um, I think what makes things difficult for these two camps, if they ever did want to have a serious conversation between how governance and culture should partake in America, just a discussion amongst Catholics, of course, is the outside world, is the pluralistic world. When you have Protestants and Jews, and of course the non-religious into the mix. Because we all have a vote in this society, we all have a say so in society. This confuses or throws Catholics off track in many ways. And we've seen this phenomenon growing lately online because as the political system in America inherently becomes much more difficult for people of faith to sort of believe in anymore. Um, um, Many Catholics are asking, where do we go from here? Right? Where do we go from here? Um, and with that, lots of questions have come up about the pluralistic nature of liberalism in American society. And so many people, like Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, who else would I throw in that camp? You have some fascist leanings, if you want to call it that. Let's remember that's not a word fascism. See, and this is a great example, fascism, right? Fascism is a word that is used sort of as an epithet of sorts thrown at each other from an American political standpoint, right? The left would throw it at the right would throw it at the left as a way to diminish the other side, to show the unjust authoritarian nature of each political party or each political ideology. And that's even itself is very odd for us Catholics because, again, because Catholicism is not inherently a democratic structural ideology or religion. That authoritarian governance in and of itself does not have to offend Catholic sensibilities, right? As long as natural law and the moral law are in place, the church is in place. These things can be an offset to an authoritarian government in power that can maintain better control of a society and a civilization, right? Where in a liberal society, it always seems to devolve into chaos, where nobody can fix the problem until you get this breaking point of a grand revolution where one side has to wipe out the other side, right? Well, in Catholic societies, that's a lot less likely to happen. You don't hear grand revolutions of Catholics killing other Catholics in order to establish order, right? Generally, you don't hear that. In Protestant societies, you get that. This is what America is. It is that melting pot that's gone astray, that melting pot that has broken down culturally. And what we see now, especially in the far left, is really the degenerate offspring of Protestantism. Something that I've talked about here for a long time, because Protestantism, it really is a move to the left, right? Protestantism effectively is a liberalizing, it is a counter revolution from Catholicism. And so it's always devolving to the left. This is why Protestant societies degenerate at a much more rapid pace than Catholic societies do, right? And eventually it leads to an atheistic society. Look at the most liberal societies that we have in Europe today: Scandinavia, Netherlands, probably the northern half of Germany, if not all of Germany at this point, right? But in general, where that Protestant Reformation line was, right, going into all of the Anglo-Protestant nations, England, all of its colonial offshoots, whether it's Canada, Australia, America, these are liberal Protestant societies that devolved at a massive rate historically compared to Catholic nations that maintained the faith. And really, many of them only lost the faith after they were bombed into an oblivion by the alliance between the classical liberals and the communists during the revolutionary period of the 19th century and the World War I, World War II era. This is important to remember, guys, right? And so when you have an American culture that's inherently Protestant and you continue to see it not only go further and further to the left, but morally deteriorate, right? Constantly becoming more and more atheistic. That is the byproduct of Protestantism. And that is important to remember. And those same ideas, right, that can be very seductive, things like freedom, liberty, the right to vote, individual rights, all this stuff that can be true in a Catholic society if isolated under proper dictates of natural law. Well, you don't have natural law and the moral law here. You have subjective interpretations of scripture is what you have over here. So what winds up happening is chaos, chaos. So whenever Catholics come online to discuss what is the best path forward, all these other ideologies come into the mix, of course, having their opinion on everything, because we're Americans, we have an opinion on everything. And so these discussions affect Catholics in many ways. That's why it's fascinating, right? When, for example, there was a fallout between Michael Knowles and Nick Fuentes about a year or two ago, or something like that now. And Nick Fuentes describes himself as an integralist. Michael Knowles, of course, works at the Daily Wire. He's more tied to the American tradition, right? The historical American tradition of constitutionalism. And when these two Catholics, and I believe they're both very devout Catholics, when these two try to kind of discuss an issue where they come from, it becomes very difficult in many ways because they have polar opposite view, both of which that can be Catholic to a certain degree, but at the same time, both of which that can be oppositely different. Now, in the case of Fuentes, who claims to, and again, if I'm misrepresenting Fuentes, please correct me, but he believes in a sort of a reestablishing an America First white nationalist cause, things of that nature. See, that's an interesting conundrum, because on the one hand, the church has never embraced the ideas of racialism, while at the same time, as I said earlier, it does allow for the fostering of cultural hegemony, right? But it's not a purely racial thing that the church has ever adopted, right? On the other side, with Michael Knowles, and I don't know Mr. Knowles' past, and I don't want to misrepresent Mr. Knowles, but I would probably assume, just judging him based upon what I've heard, and that is that he's probably a multi-generational American. I don't know if his family went to the founding. I don't know if he's byproduct of immigration of any kind, but he clearly has more of an Americanist view that he's trying his Catholicism into. And so how we deal with both of these clashes, two opposite ideologies within sort of the Catholic wars online, is very interesting, because I'm a guy that came, I'm an interesting guy because there's a lot of things that I, as an American, I have to deal with, and a lot of things an Italian, Sicilian, I have to deal with, and at the same time, try and find a way to conform those two ideologies within my Catholic faith. The one thing I can say for myself, and I can't speak for Mr. Knowles here, but I'm generally going to probably make a few presumptions right here. Okay, and if I'm wrong, please, I'll apologize to Mr. Knowles if I'm wrong here, because what I see in Mr. Knowles is very similar to what I see to be multi-generational Catholics whose families have been in America now for several generations, right? And you have this Americanization process, right? With Mr. Fuentes, I don't know his background either, but judging by the way he talks and embracing more of integrist mindset, I got a feeling that he may have a more direct tie to some ancestral society, whether I don't know if it's Hispanic society or European society, I don't know. But generally, this divide comes up because of when and where our families came to the States and began to Americanize and how we see culture. See, for me, I don't have a lot of the same guilt that multi-generational Catholics have. I'm first generation. So I am the byproduct of two worlds. I was born and raised in America as an American, educated in America, right? Lived here my entire life. But culturally, in my home, when I was raised by old school Sicilians. My parents were very old world. They were both homogenous in the sense that they were both Sicilian. They both married each other, obviously, two Sicilians. So there's no cultural breakdown in my origins. I'm full-blooded Sicilian. I'm first generation. We spoke only Sicilian in my home, being raised. And of course, there was this direct connection back to the island, right? To Sicily. And because Sicily was very Catholic and devout throughout the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, that resonated in a very strict view of Catholicism in the home. And so with me, it's a child of two worlds. I consider it born and raised in the new world, but culturally raised by my parents in the old world. And so I have a connection to both worlds. And both worlds, there's some ties to that I have affinity for both. Of course, is what is on my Italian Sicilian side, because it does present a stronger culture, a stronger religion, a more solid footing and foundation for life. While the American culture is much more open to adventure, open to prosperity, open to a greater opportunity at the material world, without a doubt, but much more shallow in terms of grounding you in your faith and in your culture and who you are, right? Both have pros and cons in many ways. And so being a child of two worlds, I have unique perspectives, or different perspectives. I don't want to say unique, right? But different perspectives on everything. For example, when I see a lot of the struggles that many Americans go through, especially with the guilt-ridden well, the attempted guilt ridden notions of, for example, the history of slavery in America, all right, or the oppression of this group or that group in America, and Americans always grappling with all these different minority groups that are struggling in many ways, and or indigenous Americans and liberal Americans and conservative Americans fighting out over the history of America, how things went down, how we associate guilt, and how we rectify this in America because of again the pluralistic tent that brings different cultures of society together and trying to work out these historical differences. I'm kind of different. When I see things like, this may be controversial for a lot of people, like, for example, we celebrate, for example, Juneteenth in America, whatever that is, or it's Martin Luther King Day in America. To me, those are all things that I don't understand. I mean, I understand the history there, right? That's been established with this narrative that goes back to American civil rights and American and Jim Crow laws and American slavery, things of that nature. But my family wasn't here for those events. I'm a child. My parents came here in the 1960s, right? I'm not second, third, or fourth generation Italian, right? That had to live through an America that was going through those things, even though those Italians didn't partake of a lot of these events, right? I mean, you take a look at something like slavery in America. That's a byproduct of the WASP culture, right? That's white Anglo Protestants mainly that had the slaves. Sure, you have some black slaves and a few offshoots. I get that, but primarily that's a white Anglo problem, right? And being from a Sicilian island, we struggled with our own issues historically over there, right? With wars and revolutions and desperate poverty over there. We step back and say, well, we had nothing to do with that. We don't even relate, right? Because Catholic societies generally don't treat each other that way. Now, you had some Catholic society, like I believe in Brazil, things of that nature, that had slavery, but the foundations of American slavery, which were Anglo-Protestant in origins, were kind of different. They're much more brutal, as we've had as we've had historian Charles Colomb on this show. It was much more brutal. Uh, American slavery, and it was based upon this subjective notion of sola scriptura, Bible interpretation of scripture that many Protestants used at the time. And inherently, it was a byproduct of the British Empire. Let's be honest here. Whatever the British Empire was for that period where they governed the high seas and what they established, in many ways, the British culture was a racist culture. They suppressed everyone around them as they colonized around the world. And race became a determining factor, defending their own race and their own culture above all those conquered peoples that they essentially overran, right? Whether it was the Irish or whether it was down in Africa or whether it was wherever you want to have it, the racial element was used as a form of justification. And so this is where you create this inherent divide between cultures. And again, I'm going back to what I began with. But with Catholics, it's a little bit different. You might have had some monarchs or some governing body of Catholic rulers that might have used slavery to a certain extent. But even that, you could tell it was more structured and it wasn't as brutal simply because of the nature of the conscience clause within Catholicism and how we're to treat everybody. This is why in Catholic nations, slavery was a lot less prevalent, right? And so the way we treat each other, the way with human dignity, there's always the church there in the background to keep us in moral check. And so this is why things like this within American culture are very odd and strange to me, because a lot of it for us Catholics, especially being Sicilian, the culture I came from, there wasn't this grand divide. Sure, we had monarchs and we had providences and structured, aristocratic classes that governed over the peasants, and there were some issues, structural issues, financial issues, economic issues there. Don't get me wrong, all those societies had those, but it strictly wasn't a transactional relationship like we saw in America. And those struggles that we get out of the founding origins of American society based upon Anglo-Protestant cultures that tend to, well, use race for that matter primarily as a vehicle for the justification of everything they did. This is why, differences between, for example, Catholic culture and Protestant culture. The Spanish went south, and then I think it was, and up north it was the French, and of course in America itself, the U.S. America, Northern America, it was the British. This is why in the Catholic territories run by the French and the Spanish, you had intermixing of marriages between, again, French and the Spanish and indigenous population, right, which would be the Native Americans or the natives, right, in America, while the British colonies in North America, primarily in the United States territory, did not intermix in marriage. They took a much more divisive racial line and effectively segregated community, right? This is why you don't see the same racial complexities in Catholic territories as you did in Protestant territories. And this is something that played out in the United States as the country was being formed early on, all the way, through the 18th, 19th, and the 20th century. And now we're dealing with the repercussions of this Protestant society and culture that gave us these problems from that origin. Catholic society has never dealt with that, never had to deal with that. Catholic society were different. Not that there wasn't problems, not that there were injustices, but it was never on that grand scale. And so you see this playing out now in some ways online in Catholic culture. I'm making a grand argument here ultimately to try and talk to you about some of these divisions within Catholic society and Catholics online and their personalities. And so when I see, for example, a Michael Knowles, who I do like, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to bash Mr. Knowles. I think he's a good guy. I get all the intentions of a good Catholic from him, without a doubt, all the outward signs at least, and so when I see Michael Knowles fall into what I call a liberal trap of sort of rebuking somebody like Fuentes as a fascist, for example, right? Because that's an American sort of epithet, if you want to call it that we throw at those that we see as having a more tyrannical nature. Now, I'll set aside Mr. Fuentes because I think Mr. Fuentes has some issues too. But I saw a video clip of this dispute, and so one of the things that Mr. Knowles does is dismisses Nick Fuentes as a fascist, and that's curious as a Catholic, especially as a European Catholic, especially as an Italian Catholic, right? Because fascism, however, liberals and Protestants and the democratic regimes of modern society, however they want to divide it, fascism was structurally a Catholic ideology in Europe. Now, whatever constructs it was developed under, right? Fascism in the grander scale, fascism with the, what do you want to call it, lowercase f, I believe it is what it would be, because true fascism, as I've defined it before, is the ideology conceived by Benito Mussolini and all its followers in Italy. But then we have, and I believe that's capitalism with the capital F, right? Then we have the lowercase fascism, which is the general tenets of authoritarian governance that arose in Europe during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, right? And that would include nations like Franco in Spain, Dolphus in Austria, who's the leader in Portugal? He had a leader in Portugal now. My mind slips, right? These were Catholic nations that were consolidating around an authoritarian regime or authoritarian form of governance in order to fend off the attacks that were coming in from the Protestant liberal republics in the West, like the British Empire in America, and of course the Bolsheviks out east that were now taking full power and spreading from the east and into Western Europe. And in order to fight these systems of that were encroaching on Western Europe, fascism developed under the ideas of protecting the last remnants of Catholic society that had begun its fall at the Protestant revolts and even taking a harder left turn at the Protestant Reformation. So fascism it offends our sensibilities in America. But fascism has real roots, whether you agree with it or not. And I disagree with a lot of it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not, again, if we throw Nazism into the fascism camp, which a lot of people do, I don't. I'm not on board with that. I'm not. The Nazi system is German inherently. It's something that they played with the faith over there, and I believe they played with it because they had to in Germany, right? Germany's problems all stem from the Protestant revolt, where it was split between Protestants and Catholics, right? That was the problem with Germany. But that's for another time. But Catholics that were inherently securely Catholic, like Italy, Spain, Portugal, Austria to a certain degree, I guess, as well too. There's no confusion that those were Catholic nations that were trying to fend off liberalism, right? If you look at, this great time period and, starting at the Protestant revolt and going through through the French Revolution and all through the grand Masonic revolutions of the 19th century, World War I, and all the way to World War II. This is effectively what it is that is liberalism bringing the end of the old world. Liberalism putting the final death nail into the realm of Christendom. And there was a few holdouts in the world, and those were the Catholic nations that didn't want liberalism in their countries. They didn't want to be governed by liberal republics. They were okay with authoritarian government as long as the natural law was in place. The natural law, the church, the faith, the sacraments were in place. Those Catholic societies were okay with authoritarian forms of government, right? It is only now, post-World War II, that fascism is kind of shamed in the sense that they were the enemies of liberalism, and liberals get to rewrite history. So when I see Michael Knowles as a Catholic, again, dismiss Nick Fuentes and cast him off as a fascist, I'm like, well, Michael, you realize as a Catholic, the fascism was part of the Catholic world, whether you like it or not. Many good Catholics, devout Catholics, in that period of history gravitated toward fascism because that's the only option they had. Fascism, whatever you may think of it, was the last line of defense, primarily against communism at the time. Yes, you had the Anglo-Protestant nations and their ill effects and their influences that were a problem too. This is why Michael Knowles, who I like, and Michael Knowles' kind of approach to politics, and that is this classical liberal attempt to try and win hearts and minds in the battle arena of ideas, as many conservatives like to say. This is why they failed so miserably in the end. Because you can't defeat communism by simply meeting them in the battle arena of ideas. What Catholics have always known is that you have to meet Marxists on the ground floor and fight them on the ground floor. This is the ultimate flaw of classical liberalism. This is the flaw of American Catholics who still refuse to understand the nature of the French Revolution, which gave us Bolshevism, and ultimately how classical liberalism aids and abets communists at the end of the day. It was not a coincidence that FDR, who was one of the most radically leftist presidents in the history of America, along with Woodrow Wilson, by the way, right? So both world wars, two world wars that America never should have been in, were led by two radically leftist presidents who were starting to coalesce behind the idea of American empire building, decided to get involved in World War I and World War II. And they both, at least in World War II, we'll set World War I aside, but in that war, FDR joined forces with Uncle Joe. FDR, a far left American president, decided to form an alliance with the Bolsheviks, right? You know who else was forming alliances with Bolsheviks even before World War II? Probably going back to the 1920s. It was the French. and their radical government. You got to understand, this alliance between FDR and Stalin was radical, and it changed the entire landscape of the world. And if Catholics don't see this, they're never going to understand what happened here. And as American society continues to devolve, especially with the political system a lot of people don't trust anymore at this point in history, this leaves many Catholics like Mr. Knowles on the outside looking in, preaching the same left and right politics that a lot of people yawn, because what Mr. Knowles is doing, with all due respect, is allowing the left to actually win, right? Because at some point you have to not just stand up in the battle arena of ideas, you have to actually go to the street level to defend what you believe. And that's something that many conservatives have never wanted to do and don't do. And that's why America has been overrun by communism at this point in history. So when one fellow Catholic vanquishes another Catholic as a fascist, I find that curious, because what Michael Knowles is actually doing is saying, all you Catholics that at one time consider yourself fascist, you're all garbage. You're all garbage. I don't care if you died for the faith in Europe, right? I don't care that American democracy could have never been implemented in those societies. I don't care if it's been democracy that has played a role in destroying the Catholic faith. The point is, I'm an American, and I have to make this work within the realm of this liberal society that I live in. And anything opposed to that politically that is fascist is an anathema to me personally, and to hell with those other Catholics. The problem is when Catholics use the term fascism as an epithet rather than to judge it on its merits, and there is some judgment to be made on those Catholic societies in a fair way, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they were perfectly orthodox in the faith. They were working with what they had. Clearly, there was some bad decisions made, but they were Catholics. And the entire world was coming down on them from the East and from the West. And they were trying to react on the fly. In many ways, Benito Mussolini's Italian fascism was concocted on a fly. Where did Benito Mussolini's fascism come from? Well, one story I've heard, I haven't quite confirmed it yet, but when Benito, for example, was a young Marxist and was rising politically, before he made his transition over to fascism, he had a conversation with Padre Pio. Yes, Saint Padre Pio, a great and beloved saint. I've heard this story, I haven't confirmed it, but I do know for a fact that the Mussolinis had a friendship with Padre Pio. I know this because Raquel, after the war, after Benito was assassinated, went down to see Padre Pio down at San Giovanni Rotondo, right? Concerned about the soul of her husband, right? After he was killed by the partisans. But it was Padre Pio, from my understanding, and again, I got to get a confirmation of the story, but this is what I've heard. It was Padre Pio that convinced Benito Mussolini that Marxism, communism was not compatible with the Catholic faith, and that he needed to conform his political ideology that would conform to something more like with Catholic society and Catholic culture, right? Right. And this is why there's fundamental differences between fascism and communism. And the differences are big, right? There in the fascist system, there is no collectivization, right? There may be a strong central government, but there's no collectivization. They didn't take private property away. They didn't suppress the proletariat, right? What else was there? They didn't suppress religion. In fact, Mussolini signed the Concordat to give the church more power in Italy, right? It was totally opposite ideology. While it might have been focused on a strong central authority, that's fine within Catholic society to have a strong central authority. That's what the monarchs were, right? Right? So my ultimate point here is, and you know, again, trying to conform all these ideas in a period of history where the entire world is coming down on you, right? And trying to figure out what is the best metric to save Catholic civilization from the impending liberal wave that would eventually consume all of Europe. And look where we're at with all those nations now. They're all gone, including America, ironically enough, right? Right? I'm going to give some leeway to those Catholic societies if they made mistakes. Germany is different. I see Germany completely different because Germany was a Protestant blend that was already problematic. There's a reason why Germany was the home of the Protestant revolts to begin with, right? And I see Germany in a different light. Some people would dispute that, but clearly there was fundamental differences between Catholic Italy and this mixed Germany, right? Between this mix between Protestants and Catholics, right? The way they viewed the world, the way they conducted themselves, right? Germans being much more industrious, Italians being much more family oriented and faith oriented in many ways, right? Same with Spain. Spain was a little bit different in Germany. Everybody does. What brought them together at the end of the day was this collaborative effort to, again, fight off the liberal world and the communist world that was invading those nations. Right? Sometimes you find, alliances in the strangest places, and that's what, as a liberals in a liberal society, we can't understand that. So whenever I hear Catholics, especially of the American brand, cast off a fellow Catholic as a fascist, as a way to demean him, I know that Catholic hasn't really taken history all that seriously and considered the plight of really the last Catholic nations that were holding on from the invasion of both liberalism and communism from the West and the East. I know Mr. Knowles has not taken it seriously, right? If Mr. Knowles would have used another word to dismiss Mr. Fuentes, right, as a white nationalist or something of that nature, that I could understand, right? Because the racial issue isn't necessarily a Catholic doctrine, right? I think as Catholics, we need to treat each other with respect. And at the very least, Mr. Knowles and Mr. Fuentes need to come together as Catholics and say, listen, we believe in this much. But what is proper and just governance for Catholics? That's a serious conversation Catholics need to have, and we don't, because we are divided in a pluralistic society. And the problem that I've always had, and I'll leave you with this, right? As a guy that considers himself an integrist, I'm open to any form of government as long as that society is Catholic, right? I believe some forms of governments are better than others, right? But I'm open to anything. I'm an open book on governance at this point. I'm very malleable as long as that society and that governance is based on Catholic teaching with the church and the sacraments in its proper place. Right? And I do believe the church has to have a role. Despite the crisis in the church we're having, we'll talk about that some other time. But that being said, Catholics need to have a serious conversation on governance and how do we move forward from here, right? Even if you believe in this thing we call American democracy, American republicanism, the founding father, fine. Okay, even if that means that. But we Catholics don't do that. Because if Mr. Knowles believes that Mr. Fuentes is a bad person simply because he's a fascist, I would suggest that Mr. Knowles hasn't taken history seriously. And it's a serious conversation that needs to be had, right? Again, I'm not on board with Mr. Fuentes on a lot of things he says, but we need to get the language straight. We need to get the language straight, right? Right? Even the notorious anti-Catholic Christopher Hitchens used to refer to fascism of the 20s, 30s, and 40s as Catholic fascism. And in some ways, he's right. He meant that as an epithet, but see, that's my point. When Michael Knowles casts off a fellow Catholic as a fascist, oh, he's just a fascist. He's doing the same thing the Protestant Anglos are doing with the Catholics, casting them aside as fascists, right? Right? Because Catholic governance in this authoritarian model is seen with great disdain by Anglo-Protestants, right? Got to remember that these are forms and ideas and languages that have come together over time. And how we Catholics treat each other, how we respect each other, how do we come together is very important. This is why it's so difficult for me to see two Catholics who have confronted each other online, have had their differences online, and it just seems like we're not talking to one another. We're both caught up, or many of us are caught up in this ideological war that has broken out within the realm of liberalism. And so this is why I find it offensive as somebody who does not call himself a fascist. I'm not a fascist. I am an integralist, right? I believe that if America was Catholic, we could work with the Constitution that we have. I think there needs to be some tweaks. That's my opinion, right? I take more of the Christopher Ferreira position, where Catholicism could work within the framework of American society and could work within the realm of the American Constitution. It has to be majorly tweaked. I will admit that. As someone who's open to maintaining the republic, I'm not looking forward to this impending civil war that even all the Protestants now, like, down south, are talking about because of everything that's gone crazy in America over the past 50, 60, 70 years. I favor an America that stays together. I love this nation. It's the land of my birth. It's the land where I raised the family. It's the land I'm going to die. I have everything invested in this nation, everything here, right? Don't confuse my Catholic integralism for being anti-American. I'm not anti-Americanism. I'm not anti-American. I love this country. In fact, I'm America first, is what I am, and protecting American interests first. But as far as dealing with the cultural structures, we have fundamental problems. And we need to change those fundamental problems. And the first thing we need to do is bring into question the dictates of liberalism and this pluralistic ideology that opens the door to everything. And I'll close with this, right? People say all the time, well, at least conservatives tell me all the time that, well, there's a big difference between classical liberalism and communism. They're not the same thing, right? When we're trying to fend off all the stuff that's happened in DC with the woke culture and the woke politics that have taken over America, classical liberals come to the defense of liberalism by saying it's different, right? Classical liberalism and communism are not the same thing. And in its most technical sense, I would agree with classical liberals. Classical liberalism and communism are not the same thing. But here's the difference. Classical liberalism opens the door to communism because of its, what do you want to call it, of its adherence to pluralism. And the moment you get a society where all ideas are equal and you can't discriminate in any kind of way because you as a society have not even determined your own values, right? Because this is the problem with American society, right? Individualism. You could believe anything you want, go anywhere you want, and have any culture you want, any religious belief you want. You can make it up on the fly. You could believe in Jesus, or you could believe in flying, rainbow ponies that shit out gold bars at the end of the day to make you happy. Can't have that kind of society. You have to have a society built and conformed on some solid foundations, right? This is why those Catholic nations, by the end of World War II, were fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their civilization to the very end, right? But you don't have that in America, where everybody can be individualistic and believe whatever it is they want to believe. When you have that type of a system, and then you have pundits like the Rush Limbaughs and the Glenn Becks, who have always talked about fighting the battle arena of ideas, freedom and liberty. Everybody has a right. Every idea has a right to exist. You just got to fight it on the battle arena of ideas. And because we have this Americanist truth on our side with this indifferent God established at the founding, we're going to win because we have we have the founding fathers and the saints and God bless America that watches over us, right? We're going to win. Well, what we've proven is that dictator's wrong. You open the door to communists, they will walk in, and communists will lie, they will cheat, they will steal, they will murder, they will hijack elections, they will manipulate, they will buy out corporations, they'll buy out the media, they'll control the libraries, they'll control Hollywood, they'll control the porn, they'll control everything to destroy and take over your society. And the funny thing about it is classical liberalism, through this open-ended idea of pluralism, allowed the communists to walk right in. And even as conservatives and classical liberals see the hijacking of American society under the dictates of this sort of closeted Marxism, they have no answers. They don't know what to do with it anymore. They got their thumb up their butt like, well, this isn't the America I know. I don't know what happened to America. What happened? You allowed them to come in because you said all ideals were equal, that everybody had an equal voice, which actually gets to the root of the problem. That is, you never established true governing principles of society. You never established a true culture. You never established a true religion in America. And with that, you couldn't be hypocrites and not allow all ideas to come in once you already have a contradictory set of beliefs here in America as it is, right? Right? That's the problem with liberalism. That's the problem with pluralism. It doesn't allow you to form a foundational truth. And it gives us a society based and founded on revolution, a revolution that nobody could ever declare is over. Here, we found truth. Let's stop the revolution. No, this is why American society is always revolting against itself. One generation revolting against their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. You cannot have a society built on revolution. You need society built on a foundation, a rock. Who does, or what does the Bible tell us the rock is in Matthew 3:16? Peter. Peter was the rock in Matthew 3:16. That was foundation of Catholicism. Peter, the chair of Peter. This is why Catholic nations lasted longer than Protestant nations. This is why Protestant nations devolved based on their own subjective, fallible interpretations of Scripture, while Catholic nations only fell after those same Protestants that fostered communism teamed up to destroy the last elements of Catholic society and Christendom. Isn't that the irony of it all? There you go, guys. I just don't like when Catholics dismiss other Catholics simply because, and I know Mr. Fuentes and Mr. Knowles have a beef, and maybe I'm looking at it top level, superficial kind of way. I get that too. And I don't know the whole history between those two guys, but I saw that, Mr. Knowles dismissing Nick Fuentes. And again, I'm not a Nick Fuentes follower or fan. I'm not a Groyper. That's not my cup of tea at all over there. But I guess it's a pattern I've seen from Catholics when they refer to other Catholics as fascists because they disagree on a style of governance. I know those Catholics throwing the F word around, the fascist word around, have been completely liberalized. And that's a problem. That's a problem when Catholics have been liberalized, because this is the reason why the Republic is teetering on the verge of collapse, because we need a solid foundation, not an ideology that teeters, right? We need a rock. We need a foundation, and that is Catholic society. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A little long rant tonight. I think that's it. I'm gonna wrap it up right there. Maybe if I have a few more thoughts, I'll do a part 2 on this, but I'll think about it. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off for Frank is Speaking. Good night, everybody.